Hey, it's Terry with Something Spooky, and in this video we're going to be talking about Sleepy Hollow, the 1999 film by Tim Burton starring Johnny Depp, Christina Ricci, and Christopher Walken. And what I'm going to be talking about specifically for Sleepy Hollow is how it scared the crap out of me as a kid, and how it's actually aged very well. And so it's not a very scary movie by adult standards or by modern standards especially, but it was such a ubiquitous movie at the time when it came out. For people my age, millennials growing up in the 90s, 2000s, it was just everywhere, and it was a very easy movie to see, and it felt like it was kind of very at the forefront of horror culture at the time. And even though it's a Tim Burton movie, it's kind of goofy, it's very action-packed, it was very scary for people my age at the time. There are a lot of things in there that really stuck with me. Again, it has this big Hollywood budget, and it has all these big names attached to it, so you don't really expect it to be that scary. And it's not. It has a lot of goofy action elements, like I said, but there's some great horseman carnage. It's basically the best representation, I think, still of the Headless Horseman and the Sleepy Hollow story by Irving Berlin. It's like basically that, to the T. There's some extra liberties taken with it, but you get almost all of the scares that you would expect, plus a lot more. And, there's just a lot of carnage that you would expect from the Headless Horseman. He's chopping heads, he's throwing pumpkins, he even like slices somebody in half. It's actually a pretty brutal movie for a Tim Burton movie, and that the Headless Horseman is made to be a very intimidating monster and figure. And the whole thing, it kind of delivers in that, and that it's exactly how I would imagine a Sleepy Hollow story. The town itself, the Headless Horseman, it all just translates very well. It's done with a lot of love for the original story. But the town itself, Sleepy Hollow, is one of the stars of the movie, and it's just so cool looking. Like the architecture is very like foreboding and twisted and weird, in a Tim Burton way. It's got, the whole town has this kind of like fog filled atmosphere at every point, and it's very shadowy, and there's a lot of blue. It just looks great. Also, like the Western Woods being right outside of town, that's such a cool creepy parallel where like they're kind of locked into this town where they already don't feel safe, but nobody wants to go out even further into the woods where there's this even bigger threat, and the woods look really cool. A lot of the time there are practical effects used that look great, and then there are some like subtle CG effects. Like I didn't notice one ever until I watched the special feature making of, but they talk about like the skulls coming out of the flames in the fireplace, and like that kind of thing is like, that's the way to do CG. As I said earlier, one of my biggest kind of praise for this movie is just how great the horseman is, with or without his head. Because when he's without his head, the Headless Horseman, he looks great. It's all the stuff you'd expect, him riding people down, big kind of chase sequences and big sword fights, and him chopping off heads and picking up heads and all of that kind of stuff. It's great. But then with, his head, even as Christopher Walken, really scared. That's part of what really scared me as a kid. I thought he was terrifying, like, with the really sharp teeth and the intense eyes, and he's always kind of growling and grimacing. But I do want to talk about like some of the big scares, the reason I think that this is still a kind of scary movie and why it was a really scary movie back then. The biggest one for me, the thing that like really bothered me in the movie is like the home invasion, where the Headless Horseman breaks into the home and kills the family, and the kid is hiding in the floorboards. And even though it is a big action scene, there's like this big sword fight. There's still a lot of tension, with the kid and the mom like hiding, and the light on the wall from like the little toy, especially once it gets down to just the horseman and he and the kid, and he's chopping up the floor, and he's got the parents like heads in his hand. It's pretty gruesome. I mean, like I said, for Tim Burton, it's actually pretty intense, when you think about what those visuals are. And then he does get the kid, which is also unusual for, any movie, especially a movie back then. It's pretty grim. So like at the time, I remember that bothered me, and like that really stuck with me for a while. Another one like that is the church attack scene when everybody's hiding in the church. This is later in the movie. And it, is just, it really goes to show the chaos of the whole ordeal, and how like nobody feels safe and nowhere is safe. I mean, here is everybody in town, together at once, kind of aligned, but everybody's just panicking and scared, and they're in a church, so you think maybe there's like some safety there, but there's not. Spoilers, he gets people from outside the church, going into the church, and so that just feels like kind of unsettling and sacrilegious right there. Like the way that all unfolds also kind of just really creeped me out, because it's like, man, they're all together, they're in this church, and they're still not safe. He can still get to them. Overall, the movie is still not like super scary, and a lot of that has to do with, the elements of Tim Burton movies, as much as I love Tim Burton. But there is like goofy humor, just kind of like weird tongue-in-cheek stuff. Johnny Depp is, although I praised his performance and I think he's great as Ichabod Crane, like, it's hard to get too scared when Johnny Depp's, in the movie. Like, even though he comes from Nightmare on Elm Street, obviously he doesn't have a horror, background. And in this role, you're not really too worried about him. He's almost like an action hero as Ichabod Crane. I think the biggest thing is the Danny Elfman soundtrack. And I love Danny Elfman, and he works well with Tim Burton, and they're very much linked in that kind of way. But it is not really like horror soundtrack. It's so bombastic. Like, you can tell that Danny Elfman is a John Williams fan, because it's always this kind of like big flaring triumphant music, and it's not really meant to be scary. Even like during this most tense, scary scenes, the soundtrack is usually just blaring away and really kind of taking over the scene, which is part of, what Danny Elfman does and how him and Tim Burton work together, but it just makes it not really feel like a horror movie. There are a few more things, though, that I do think are kind of interesting in the way it does some of its scares that I'll just touch on quickly. One is that I think that it makes science scary in a way that's interesting to the time, because, it probably was a scary thing at the time. It was a very unenlightened age, and we see that from, the way people react to Ichabod Crane and all of his gadgets and methods. Like, he's considered kind of crazy and out there. And the film, does like shows that, really emphasizes that in the way that we get like close-ups of his like weird goggles and gadgets, and he's like doing the amputation or dissection rather, and it's just like, it's all very kind of like greeted with at best skepticism, usually outright horror from the people around him. So it's interesting how it touches on that stuff, which must have been kind of true for the time. Also, there was all the stuff with Ichabod's mom and his parents. There's this whole like weird surreal angle with like these pagan versus Christian undertones. I don't think any of that is really in the book. It's kind of invented for the movie, but it's some of the most graphic stuff in the movie, and some of the most kind of like recurring, like big bloody scares, because it kind of culminates in the Iron Maiden scene where he like in the dream finds his mom and the Iron Maiden and the blood rushes out. It's pretty intense, actually, and it's kind of all like underneath the main horror and plot of the story, but it's adding this disturbing element the whole time. There's all the witch stuff, they go and meet the witch in the woods, and like, that's all kind of spooky. The witch like jumps out. It's one of the worst, offending points of the CG in the movie, but still it's in there, and it's yet another layer of horror. And then, have to mention the spooky tree. I love that tree. I think it may be the coolest tree ever in any movie. Give that tree like a Academy Award or whatever. It bleeds. It has heads in it. It's a gateway, to the other realm. The horseman literally like rides in and out of it. And it's this awesome looking tree, kind of this stereotypical Halloween tree that you'd see in like a ceramic decoration or something. It's all big and crooked and bare. It's just so cool. It's such a cool, creepy tree. So, maybe the Conjuring tree or whatever else could contend with it. But I think it's going to be my pick for best tree ever. Ultimately, like I said, the movie's not really scary. It is kind of disturbing. It's surprisingly violent, I think, for the cast and Tim Burton. It is rated R, so, even though I saw it as a teenager, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to kids. It's not really meant for that. But still, at the same time, it's not going to really be scary for a lot of adults, or at least a lot of, horror fans. So it's in this weird middle ground. And as it fades, it's more than 20 years old now, it starts to feel more and more like just an action, fun movie starring Johnny Depp and made by Tim Burton. But I think, if you actually go back and watch it and think about what it was kind of doing at the time and who was seeing it, it was very scary for the time and for what it was. And I still really love the movie. I revisited it before doing this video, and I really enjoy it still. I've watched it, my whole life, and I think it's a pretty unique movie. Kind of has its own weird little corner of horror history, because it's not a story that we see done a lot still. It's still kind of the definitive telling of Sleepy Hollow in film. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like, share it, and remember to follow Something Spooky. Thanks.